get you to accept, you know. What is it in the Bible they want you to accept? That we need to be building an ark made out of gopher wood? That's in the Bible. The Bible, as we've also made mention of, reveals to us that there is no God. But, of course, it identifies the fool as the one that said that in his heart. So, you know, what is it? So, it all fits in the category of, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, of handling aright or rightly dividing the word of truth. Okay? And knowing that there have been 3 dispensations of time that have existed in the history of man, and we are living in the 3rd dispensation of time, the Christian system, the dispensation in which we are responsible to the Christ. Remember, in Hebrews chapter 1, at verse 1, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past by the fathers to the prophets, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son. So the last days are the days in which the Hebrew writer was writing, and that's the time frame in which we are living. It's the last days. If it's the last days, then that means there's not going to be any more dispensations or days after this one. When this dispensation ends, the end of the world comes. Judgment takes place. And so when we're rightly dividing the word of truth, involved in that as well is recognizing that even though the Old Testament in our Bibles ends at Malachi, the law was still operative until Acts chapter 2 and the establishment of the Lord's cause in Jerusalem, the church being established, the eternal kingdom being formed. And from that day forward then, of course, nationalities, color of skin, language, none of that matters. Everybody and anybody that is saved is going to have to be saved the exact same way, and that's by the gospel. The gospel is God's power to save. But when it comes to these first 4 books in the New Testament, and then throughout the rest of the New Testament, there's a number of questions that we can't really fill in by simply looking at what has transpired in inspiration in the Old Testament. There are people, I wrote a list of things. Think about this. Where did the Herods come from anyhow? Now we know, I preached a sermon not too long ago on the Herods, and I even made mention of one of the women during that time frame, and mentioned what her name was, and I didn't think anybody in the congregation had that name, of course, and so I said, you know, if you're in that a line of Herods, and they were all bloodthirsty cutthroats, women included, then here's a name that you, and lo and behold, there was somebody, their middle name was that name, you know, and I apologized, you know. So I'm sorry, your mom and dad didn't know what they was doing when they named you, you know. So, but that's, of course, most people are not aware of that. But the Herods, where'd they come from? You know, how in the world did they get into a position of power? Well, you don't know that without this time between the Testaments. Who were the Epicureans and the Stoics? I mean, here's these philosophers that Paul's having to deal with on Mars Hill in the city of Athens in Acts chapter 17, and you say, I don't remember ever hearing about them before. Well, you don't, unless you know what transpired during this intermittent period of time, the 400 years in which God is not prophesied. Of course, we mentioned the Sadducees and the Pharisees, but also into that group of Pharisees and Sadducees, we'd have to throw the scribes. And while the scribes, of course, had a tremendous role to play in the Old Testament, for example, Ezra, you know, was a ready scribe, a great man for sure, then there was a greater significance attached to that particular group of people in the days of Jesus than had been previously. You know, here were individuals who were given the responsibility of copying God's word. Well, along with that, right or wrong, people looked to them as authorities, when it may have been they were just real good at copying words, you know. Were they really authority? Now, they should have been more familiar with God's word than the regular person on the street, seeing how they're seeing it all the time as they're copying it. But that don't mean they're the authority just because they are good writers or they are real good at penmanship, you know. I've known some people that could write pretty that didn't know doodly squat about a lot of stuff, you know, and you have too. what's the significance? And we'll end up having to we'll talk about this later on. The cities of Decapolis, that arises with the early church. What's the significance of the Grecian widows being overlooked in the daily distribution of funds that the Grecians sought assistance from the apostles to take care of that oversight, if indeed there was an oversight, trying to make things fair. Well, what's the difference? What's a Grecian Jew and what's a Hellenistic Jew? What's the difference? Well, we have to go between the Testaments to figure that out. And why did Jesus, on some instances, tell individuals who recognized him who he was, who had maybe been the beneficiary of a miracle, and he told them, don't tell anybody, when he would tell other people, go tell everybody you know? What's with that? Is it flipping a coin? Go tell. Don't go tell. Well, see, as God's plan was carried out, there was a means and a pattern to follow, even in the carrying out of the Great Commission, and we'll deal with that as well. And there happens to be online something I'd encourage you to watch from World Video Bible School. It's a 2-video set by Johnny Ramsey on this very material, and it would be highly beneficial to you. Of course, Johnny could take trigonometry and make it interesting, but he is a very, very good Bible teacher, and they're free of charge, obviously. I think we've got some cards back there in the back. It's got World Video Bible School .org or com or something like that. And you can go on there and watch just about anything they've got available to purchase. You can watch it free of charge on your television or on your computer. So I would encourage you to do that. And this all fits into the same general category, so that Paul would be able to say in Galatians 4, verse 4, in the fullness of time, God sent forth the Son, born of a woman, born under the law. In other words, Jesus was born under the Mosaic system of things. Jesus was not a Christian. John the Baptist was not a Christian. You see, all these individuals who did their work prior to the cross were not Christians. Adam and Eve weren't Christians. Moses wasn't a Christian. Solomon, David, Saul, they weren't Christians. They couldn't be, because they lived prior to there being any such thing as Christianity, you see. Now, we're not throwing off on them. They could be faithful living under a previous law, but there again, the distinction in time frames is highly beneficial as well. What us to do is pick up here on page number 7, on page number 7 in our material. We looked at just a little bit at the top, and hopefully it will impress upon us as much as it was supposed to be impressed upon the mind of the children of Israel as to how God absolutely despised, was opposed to, didn't want anything to do with, and didn't want his people to have anything to do with idolatry, because of the situation that oftentimes existed right out in the open with idolatrous practices was all types of sin, sexual sin, perversions. And thus, if you incorporate, and you just think about, how far this country has come in the mingling together of that type of thing with so-called worship, So it really doesn't surprise us, because it's been going on as long as man has existed, just about. The intermingling of worldliness with worship, and somehow thinking that it's fine and dandy as long as you're doing what makes you feel good, that makes you feel like you're getting closer to God, then nobody has the right to say anything about it, even if you're engaged in behavior that is sinful, Well, who can believe that? Well, multiplied millions continue to believe that. And so all these various gods at the top of the page, even down to the point, and of course we see this all the way back even to when Isaac goes to get him a wife from his uncle, They had their own patron gods. Now, that word patron and associated with gods, in our way of thinking, is strange. But if you simply change gods to saints, then we're talking about the modern world in which we live, because of all these cities throughout the world who have their own patron saint. And they don't mean saint as the Bible uses the term saint. They mean some special person who maybe lived there for a time and did some good stuff. And so now they have access to the throne of God through this person who's just a human being, as if he's an outlet to the Father in heaven, when he's not, you know. We have one high priest, and that's Jesus Christ, and it's through him that we get to the Father in heaven. We pray to the Father in heaven. It's the Father in heaven that we worship, and we worship him and we pray to him through Jesus Christ, okay? And that's more than just a way of saying it. That's the accurate, provable way of saying it, you know. And so we need to be careful and make sure we don't leave an impression other than that. So these patron gods of these individual cities, is almost like back in the day, not too many years ago, in which every small town had a baseball team, you know. And they were all time vying for who's got the best baseball team. And there was some, and I'm not familiar with how much went on around here, but up in Smith County, there's some mineral wells up there, and Sampson mineral wells. And they had a big old field there that was built just for playing baseball. And they played baseball every Sunday. And they had evidently some really good teams. And they traveled there across the ferry there at Rome, across the Cumberland River from all over, and came from the west and played baseball. And every team got bragging rights. Well, that same type of mentality went along into these pagan deities. You were devoted to a certain god, and of course you thought a whole lot higher of your God than you did the God of the town that lived next to you. That's just how silly denominationalism is. Now, at some point in time, you would think somebody says, well, wait a minute. If we got all these different gods, then how do we explain all this turmoil that exists? I mean, we got patron God over here at City A fighting with patron God over here at City B, and they almost destroy each other. And that's all brought about by God? I got a problem with that God, don't you? Well, evidently it didn't, because they kept on following that same type of reasoning. In Roman numeral number 7, when you read about the Assyrians, you start to understand why Jonah, well, I don't know if I say you start to understand, but it gives you a basis for thinking about what Jonah was thinking about when he refused to go preach to Nineveh at first. Now, when you first read that story, when you first heard the story of Jonah and being told, and when he went in the opposite direction of where he's supposed to go, did not we all think, erroneously, that he went in the opposite direction because he was scared to death? I mean, that's what I thought until I read the rest of the story, you know, a Paul Harvey idea. But that wasn't the reason. Now, obviously, there was a whole lot of reason to be scared of the Syrians because of how violent, how bloodthirsty they really were. And some of the things that they were guilty of is mentioned down here, you know. I mean, they would kill men, women, and children, old men, old women, bash babies against the ground, you know. They would impale citizens of a city that they'd conquered and put it around the city, you know, and that was a object lesson to anybody else that would try to mess with them, you know. If you see a city surrounded with a bunch of people impaled on poles, they beheaded people, they cut people's hands off, cut their feet off. I mean, they did about everything bad that you could possibly. They even, and it's not listed here, but I've read in other history books where they would skin people alive and leave them impaled on poles. Yes, sir. It looked like a medical textbook kind of, you know. Yeah. It was laid bare, and you could see sort of like what Darth Vader looked like when he was skinless after he got it burned off or something. Yeah. Well, that's the next class down that would know all about that. But that just happened to be on last night. I never had seen that part where he crawls up out of there, and then all that's left is his insides, you know. And So that explains where he came. I only saw the first Star Wars, so I don't know all the rest of it happened, but there's been about 1,400 of those movies, I reckon. But skinning somebody alive, that would leave quite an impression on the people who were fearful of being conquered. And of course, if you could pay your way out of a situation like that, and you had the resources too, you might do without dessert for a few weeks just so you wouldn't have to face them in battle, or be overtaken by them. And so that's what happened during this whole period of time. They were fighting and warring all the time, just like goes on in our world today. And so when Jonah goes to the city, a heathen city, not a Jewish city, not people that are living under the law of Moses, they're not held accountable to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy or anything like that, But yet he's told to go and preach a simple message, yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown or destroyed. Okay? That was his message. Now you talk about a negative sermon, that's it. There ain't nothing positive about that at all. However, every time that God commissions somebody to preach a quote-unquote negative sermon like that, built into the sermon, because of numerous examples previous of this being the case, built into the sermon is, if I cease and desist what I'm doing and am truly sorry for it, then God just might extend his mercy my way. And he always did, when people really did change their attitude and their action, see. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Nineveh. And of course, when that did happen, that's where we see the true colors of Jonah, And of course, you can't be too hard on Jonah, because he simply had the patriotic mentality that many of us sometimes do, had rather see a country destroyed than saved, had rather see a nation wiped off the face of the earth instead of converted, Somebody said, well, we wouldn't do that. Well, really? How about during the Cold War? Wouldn't it have been a whole lot easier? How many times did you think, I'm getting sick and tired of hiding under my desk at school, afraid that an atomic bomb is going to hit Oak Ridge and we're going to be burned up, and hiding under your desk? I never have figured out how that's going to save you, or stand over next to the wall, get real low maybe, I don't. But maybe one of them atomic bombs they send our way will be diverted right back on top of them, So the mentality that Jonah had was patriotism, despising an enemy of God for sure, up to and including not wanting them to change because he wanted them to be destroyed. And so when the king on down repented in sackcloth and ashes, and God says, all right, I'm not going to destroy the city no more, there was 120,000 that didn't know their right hand from their left hand, which means kids, I'm pretty sure, very young kids. Although Ruth told me she didn't know her right hand from left, and she's not a kid anymore. Yeah, but I shouldn't have said that, Ruth, sorry. And Jonah was upset. He says, I knew it. I just knew they'd quit being mean, and they'd say they was going to turn around, and I knew that God would be merciful to it, and he wouldn't destroy them. They said, I knew it. And he got so mad, he went up and sat on the side of a hill, was looking for a fireworks show, and then all of a sudden there's no fireworks show, and he's upset. And he has more concern for a silly plant that's giving him shade than he does for people who've got a soul, So Jonah was not scared of going to Nineveh. He didn't want to go to Nineveh because he thought his preaching might have a positive effect. Don't sound very good preacher, does it? But nonetheless, that's him. So that's the Assyrians. And of course, we could go into other detail, but let's jump to Babylon real quick. Because when it comes to the individual that was seen in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, this is where those four kingdoms actually start. All right? But when you're dealing with Babylon, you're not talking about a Johnny-come-lately kingdom because of the existence of them. All the way back, as was read in our devotional reading a few minutes ago, Nimrod was actually the founding father of that area, and thus a city was developed there that rose in prominence over time, just like many of these cities. It was the greatest city in the world at times. And so by the time that he comes along here with Nebuchadnezzar, it's sometimes referred to as the Neo-Babylonian Empire or the New Babylonian Empire. Well, it's the same place, but its prominence that had existed 1,000 years previous, that had gone south for many, many years, now rises again, but it's the same group of people. And in our material here, it identifies just exactly where we're talking about, associated with the Fertile Crescent that Ricky brought up the other night. Notice Shinar here. That's exactly the place that was read in our devotional reading in Genesis chapter 10, where the city began. Also, of course, there's another word that's used, especially in the prophets, concerning these people, and they're not called Babylonians, they're called Chaldeans, and that, of course, means from the territory in which they were derived. There's a lot of words that I got accosted one time online because I said something about the Jews, and I was simply making reference to the children of Israel, and this person said, "You dumbo, don't you have any more sense than you don't call the whole nation the Jews, because the Jews were simply citizens of the southern kingdom of Judah, and so Judah and Israel are two different countries." So I said, okay, I'll take the reprimand. But we use words interchangeably, and that's what a dictionary does, It uses a word the way it is used in the present vernacular, whether right or wrong. And of course, we point out all the time, you can't depend upon Webster's dictionary to give you a correct biblical definition of just about anything, certainly not baptism or faith or anything like that. And so we do need to use Bible terms in Bible ways. Hebrews is more than simply the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. It has a reference to those who came from Eber. So, in a strict sense, even, get this, Muslims are Hebrews. You gotta be kidding me. Yeah. That's where they originate, if you go far enough back, And if you go far enough back in everybody's family tree, of course, you get everybody starting in the Garden of Eden. So, what's accomplished by that? Suppose you get your DNA checked and you find out that you've got 33% descendants from the Scandinavian country, Well, does that mean you're oddball because your hair ain't blonde and your eyes are not blue-eyed, Well, of course not. All those things can only tell you about your ancestry. It doesn't tell you about you, who you are, But people think that it does sometimes, sadly. And when he used this term, the cradle of civilization, then obviously you're thinking then to where man first existed, and that was where? In the Garden of Eden, So if in this Fertile Crescent, and in the midst of the Babylonian Empire, in a city called Babylon, in close proximity to where man first lived, there's not anything that would lead us to conclude that's erroneous. Between the two rivers, we know the four rivers are mentioned in the book of Genesis concerning where Eden was. So if that is the case, that's fine and dandy. And during that period of time, because of its closeness and proximity to all this water, and then the development of wonderful irrigation systems and all, then the country flourished for a number of years. If you'll notice there, and this is something that it's not well known, but when you're talking about the city, you've got a plan that is followed. It doesn't just start, they got a little grocery store here and then everything grows up around it. No, they have a plan for the laying out of the roads and the laying out of the canals and everything, and they develop from that, which is, you might think that's a modern day invention, but it's not in reality because it goes all the way back to this period of time. And by the time, notice down here during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, it was the main city of the world, obviously. Just like we would call Rome the center of the world during the days of Jesus and the apostles. It was the center of the world at this time. It covered an area of 200 square miles. That's pretty big, ain't it? That's a large metropolis situated there on both sides of the Euphrates River. The streets had been laid out so that they intersected one another at right angles. They knew math, believe it or not. You know, math didn't start with Grace Patton. They knew all about it way back here a long time ago. They had walls surrounding the city that were wide enough for chariots to pass by on the top. And of course, we've talked about before Nineveh being a city that had a wall around it that 3 chariots could walk around, could drive around on the top of it, you know. And it was 100 foot high, and there was towers 150 foot above that, and 1 million people lived there. I mean, it's, you know, these are things that we'd have loved to have been able to see at that time because of the engineering that went into doing it, and they didn't have all that we have available to us today. And then notice in later history, Nebuchadnezzar had some hanging gardens, which were classified at that time as being one of the 7 wonders of the world, you know. Does anybody know how many 7 wonders of the world there has been down there? At least 7,000, I guess, you know. I guess it's from whichever country you are, you've got your own 7 wonders of the world inside your territory. So it was a prominent place. But then by the time that the book of Revelation is written, and as there's a comparison that's made concerning the city and its ungodly attitude and action, and it's pictured as being the enemy of God and all that's associated with it. Notice in the passage here, the symbolizing in the book of Revelation, the world and the world's wickedness was all pictured as being Babylon, that great harlot, you know. Now, when it comes to applying these principles, and this is, I sort of hesitate to say this, I went and saw Grand Funk Railroad at Moore Auditorium, and they were passing out pamphlets, and it had, the title of the pamphlet was America the Whore, okay? And it was using this to say that America is Babylon the Great, and that, and this is right after they came out with their album, We're an American Band. They were anti-American, and I remember Mark Farner said, people's walking around, look just like you, that's passing out literature, don't take it, you know. And so here they were propagating the idea that America was Babylon. So it's sort of like, you know, putting the number 666 on everybody from Ronald Reagan to Charles Chaplin, I guess, you know. I mean, people will do just about anything to try to accomplish that. And, of course, that's the misuse of scriptures for sure. Now, when it came down to the time of applying Babylon and what happened with them to the children of Israel, and especially in the southern kingdom of Judah, then we studied a whole lot of that in our previous study, and that on the next page, page 9, has a whole lot of that written down here. The interaction with Hezekiah, all that went on during the days of these rulers of the Babylonian Empire, some mentioned in specific detail in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. And when you're reading the book of Daniel, here you start off with Nebuchadnezzar on the throne, and then lo and behold, you turn a couple of pages and here's Belshazzar on the throne. You say, what's going on here? Well, the time frame is not like 2 minutes, that it took you to read that for these things to transpire, because Belshazzar ends up being the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's actually ruling on the throne with his father at the same time. The terminology they use to describe that's co-regents, which are co-leaders, and that happened at different times and throughout history. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, it says at the bottom of the page, he was a great builder, a great conqueror, and significant to us is that he's referred to as a servant of Jehovah. Now here is a Babylonian king who was a great leader without a doubt, but are all quote unquote great leaders servants of Jehovah? How was he a servant of Jehovah? Why would he be looked upon as a minister of God for any good? All right. God used him to give the southern kingdom of Judah a whipping, to discipline them. It was through his instrumentality that they received their punishment for their crimes, their sin against God. And the sad thing is, you know, one of the passages that really stands out, at least to me, in the book of Lamentations, when Jeremiah, of course, is writing after they have been overtaken by the Babylonians and all, when he cries out for mercy, he says, "Oh, is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by?" Lamentations chapter 1 at verse 12. Don't you, in other words, don't you feel sorry for us? The city of Jerusalem is crying out for sympathy. And of course, Jeremiah has great difficulty feeling any sympathy for them because he's been warning them for decades that this is going to happen if they don't straighten up and fly right. So you have real trouble feeling sorry for the people, except there's some young people. There's children there that are suffering right along with adults. They didn't do it, but they're having to suffer the consequences anyhow of their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and priests and false prophets. Because of their sin, they're having to suffer right along with them. And we look at that and say, that ain't fair, you know. But help us to realize that payday ain't always today. There is a payday. Oh, exactly. Exactly. And when the children of Israel marched in the land of Canaan, you know, a bunch of children there, for sure. All right, we'll have to pick up here. We're going to look at religiously beginning on a Wednesday night on page 10.